Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies in Northern Virginia, and we're here with Lieutenant General Dave Deptula of the United States Air Force, retired, who is the Dean of the Institute. Dave, thanks for joining us.
You bet, Vago. Great to be here.
You guys issued a new report on remotely piloted aircraft. That's something that you focused a lot of time and attention on. You were one of the fathers of the Air Force's remotely piloted aircraft fleet, and also as the Chief of Intelligence, that was actually your key charge, was to increase the number of orbits at the time that the Air Force had to support this capability. And one of the things you've always talked about is the need to revamp how this is done. There's an insatiable demand for RPA services, and you guys rolled this, your latest report out recently up on Capitol Hill. We missed it because we were in the Paris Air Show. Talk to us a little bit about what the key tenets and the key case you're making. What's the problem that needs to be solved, and how does that problem need to be solved?
Well, Vago, thanks for the opportunity to chat about this. Consolidating the revolution, optimizing the use of remotely piloted aircraft, was really designed to highlight, as you did so well in your introduction, the fact that because remotely piloted aircraft are undergoing an insatiable demand for the capability that they bring, it's time that the Department of Defense take a look at how these systems can be incorporated in a much more economical, efficient, as well as effective fashion. So what we did was we undertook a study of over a year, basically looked at three areas. First one, technologies that could be embraced and employed. Second one, acquisition, changes in that system that could help all the services move forward. And then third, organizational changes that the department might want to consider. So we came up with 22 recommendations for the department to consider. And those are highlighted in the paper, and I'd be happy to give you a taste of each one of those if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I would. What are sort of the top things that need to happen at an OSD level? Talk to us a little bit about sort of the top acquisition changes you'd make, and then talk to us also about how the services themselves, because each one of the services is going to have, within a couple of years, they either have robust capability or are going to have a lot more robust capability. For example, as the U.S. Navy brings their version of the Global Hawk, the Triton, aboard, that's going to be a step change in sort of seacoast, at sea, and a reconnaissance capability that can be used anywhere on the planet, almost as seamlessly as anything that the United States Air Force is using.
Right. Well, we divided the report, as I mentioned, into three areas: organization, technology, acquisition. So let me, since you brought up the example of Triton, let me start with organization first, and just give you two areas the department might want to look at. First, much of the discussion in terms of capacity need has been focused on orbits. Or combat air patrols, or now the latest term is line. Those are input measures. A soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine really doesn't care about the number of orbits of UAVs or drones or RPAs or whatever you'd like to call these things. What they're interested in is their situational awareness being enhanced by that device that they have in their hand. So the department needs to take a look at a way to describe output or measure of merit that's coming from these vehicles, as opposed to just counting the number of orbits. So that's one area that organizationally needs to be addressed. The second one is the department needs to reflect upon organizationally what it could do to better integrate in the development, design, and acquisition piece of the formula when it gets to delivering capability. And you know, there are ways to do that. We reintroduced the notion that the department ought to take a look at this idea of executive agency. The department's 10 years removed from when that was last introduced. There's a lot of controversy, but hopefully the department's matured since then, and the conditions have changed. We're facing much, much more dramatic resource constraints today than we have in the past. So some of the misperceptions about that idea is that whoever the executive agent might be would exert operational control, but that's not true at all. What we're looking at is kind of a embodying common sense when it comes to development.
So is a little bit of the argument that you're making is that this is similar to, for example, the United States Army and rifles and firearms and things, where the United States Army tends to be, because it's the biggest buyer of weapons, small arms, that it is the executive agent when it comes to stuff like that.
Right. And really what this is about is empowering someone with authority to ensure commonality where it makes sense across the different service procurement efforts. I mean, the services still retain procurement control, and the combatant commands are the ones who have execution authority in terms of operations. This is about making smart decisions. You know, it's better buying power applied to remotely piloted aircraft in the medium and high altitude category across the Department of Defense. So let me move on to acquisition. If we take a look at some of the initiatives we're looking at in the acquisition realm, we're very much interested in, and the remotely piloted aircraft area is a perfect place to take a look at accelerated innovation in terms of bringing on new systems very, very quickly to model the commercial world. You know, until recently, it took up to 3 years just to get a software upgrade for the MQ-9. You know, now we've gotten as good as 18 months. Look at what commercial industry is doing.
Do you think, what are different ways to use this capability? Because if you add up all the capability the United States Army has, you add up all the capability the Air Force has, you add up all the capability the Navy is going to have, and the Marine Corps is working on that tactical piece of it as well, including with some systems that are going to have some range and persistence to them once they're deployed. And yet we're still finding that we don't have enough capacity to satisfy. What are some of the filters we have to use before using this? You know, are there different operational concepts we need to employ? What's the best way? Because there is a vast capacity and capability, but how do we make the most of it in the most efficient manner, given that, you know, it seems like the more we build, the more the demand ends up going up.
Well, that's true, and that's an extraordinarily enormous, in terms of its breadth, question that you ask. Where we use these things is only limited by the imagination of people to apply remotely operated and soon to be autonomously operated vehicles in the realm of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, strike, maneuver, sustainment, mobility. Every one of the military's mission areas are open for exploitation by remotely piloted aircraft. So they're going to have to be incorporated as part of the panoply of capabilities that the department is responsible for. Let me get back to my point on some of the highlights in the acquisition area. One of the ones that we highlighted is the self-imposed restraints that the United States government puts on exploiting and capitalizing on these vehicles and how they can be shared with our allies due to anachronistic regulations and treaties. Recently, we had a key ally in our efforts to fight the Islamic State who wanted to procure the MQ-9. The State Department disavowed or disallowed that procurement. So what did that country do? They went to China and bought China systems. So now we have the PRC who's operating inside one of our key allies' nations to help them acquire their systems. That is not conducive to building partnership capacity.
You're talking about the missile technology
MCT
control regime that talks about range and payload, and then it can be a weapon. But the United States has approved, you know, all of our allies have gone through that. You know, the UK had to go through that. Italy went through that. France ended up going through it. The process has always approved the capability for an ally. It's just taken a little bit of time in order to try to get there.
It's not necessary, and we have to change some of these anachronistic treaties and rules and restrictions. Look, there are 70 nations around the world that are working very, very hard to achieve the kind of capability that we currently have. And following the MCTR is not going to restrain those nations. So we need to be exporting this technology and these capabilities to our friends and allies alike. Let me move on, if I may, to technological advancements that we need to rapidly implement. The whole notion of open architectures and modular systems, plug-and-play systems, needs to be imposed across the services, getting back to that authority to implement those kinds of capabilities, which would allow the rapid shifting of capability on one platform. The majority of the platforms today are all self-wired for a particular set of capabilities. Moving to modularity is something that would be very, very important and would increase the efficiency and effectiveness of our systems. The second one, which has been implemented by the Army, as well as the Air Force with its Global Hawk and Navy with Triton, is automatic takeoff and landing. The Air Force is yet to put this capability on its MQ-9 force and MQ-1 force, which is being retired, so no need to do that. But the United States Army, with its Gray Eagle and the Global Hawk fleet, have not had one accident when it comes to takeoff or landing. Meanwhile, the majority of the accidents in the MQ-1, MQ-9 force have been during takeoff and landing. So let's put that technology on board the airplane. It'd pay for itself, avoiding 3 accidents. Another one, sense and avoid. Here we are. It's been over a decade since we've been working with the FAA to work out procedures to be able to operate these vehicles in controlled airspace. And there are systems out there that allow for onboard sense and avoid capability that need to be put on these aircraft so we can move forward. So that's just kind of a flavor of what's included in the report. Like I mentioned, there are 22 recommendations, and we would urge those out there who are working in the realm of remotely piloted aircraft, UAVs, to take a look at the report.
Let me go to the appetite control question, though. Just because people have access to it, they use it, and it's often, or sometimes for good reason, but sometimes may not be. What's the way to meter that demand in a prudent way, in a thoughtful way, to try to stretch it out so that you're not burning up resources, perhaps, potentially without as much merit as you might want?
Yeah, well, look, ultimately that boils down to...
because everybody will want an overhead asset if they can get their hands on it, ultimately.
Well, that's true, but it's very dependent upon the circumstances in the situation. I also hearken back to, there's a lot of capacity that is existent in the United States military today, but because of operating modalities and culture, we don't use all of it. You know,
hold on 1 second. Is he good centered?
Yeah, he's been centered.
Okay, lovely.
This has been much better than the last book.
For example, you know, this is once again, it's a subject that the different services will react to differently. But you know, back in the mid-90s, there was an enormous spike in demand for full motion video. So Secretary Gates turned to the Air Force and said, I want 15 more orbits of MQ-9s. Well, at that particular moment in time, there were 80 orbit equivalents of FMV-capable RPAs.
Full motion video,
remotely piloted aircraft, resident in the Army. But because their operating concept was that those vehicles, in this case Ravens, were organically assigned to units, only those units that were deployed had the capability that was being used in the fight. So you had you know, virtually 90% of the Army's full motion video capability in garrison. So there are just simple things that can be done to move that capability forward and use it in an integrated fashion by combatant commands that can alleviate some of this demand issue.
Isn't that why the United States Air Force was founded in 1947, in part because of the way air power was being used historically by the Army in a very similar fashion?
Right. I mean, you go back to Kasserine Pass and the results of, you know, penny packeting of air power, and every unit wanted its own as opposed to integrated use for the betterment of the entire operation. But the fact of the matter is, in this day and age, we have to look at kind of shedding some of our organizational predilections as resource constraints force us into a smarter way of doing business.
Let me ask you one last question. One of the priorities you had when you were in uniform was to try to get as much data out of each hour of aircraft operation per remotely piloted aircraft that you could. But the challenge that that posed was it was a lot more data that then had to be analyzed. And that's what led me to once editorialize that it was becoming the United States analytic force because it was spending so much time analyzing that RPA data. Are there better ways of eating? Obviously technology has improved. We're using a lot more queuing technology ultimately, but is this still a very labor, human, manpower intensive effort? What are some of the things that can be done on the back end of this with all the data that these systems are generating to be able to properly process what's coming off of each of these aircraft?
Okay, well, the first thing I'd recommend is we need to invert the paradigm that we currently operate under, which essentially is that we will download everything we collect and then analyze it. If you look at wide area airborne surveillance systems like Gorgon Stair as an example, the amount of data that it collects is enormous. So much so that you can't pipe it all down in time to do real-time analysis. You got to wait till the airplane lands, pull off the data, analyze it. We're getting to the point today, we have been at the point where with the increase in processing capability, we can do onboard processing. We can do filtering. Because you're looking at an enormous area at one time, I dare say over 99% of the data collected is garbage. It's not what we need. It's not what we're really after. So greater onboard processing of the elements that we are searching for can be done and instituted today. Now, yeah, at some point, Intel analysts want to analyze everything. Well, you can do that later. You still have the ability to capture and review the data after an aircraft's landed, but with onboard processing capability that's queued to what it is that you're looking for, we can do much better in terms of getting right to the heart of what's of interest and analyzing it in real time.
Dave, thanks very much for all your time. We really appreciate it.
Good. Glad to be here as always.